People always ask what it's like when someone you've mourned for 10 years suddenly comes home. The truth is, you don't feel relief. You feel terror. Because the first thing I noticed about James Bergstrom wasn't that he had come back, it was that he hadn't aged a single day. If you're new here, you're in the right place for chilling horror stories that feel unsettlingly real. Grab a seat, turn the lights down if you dare, and settle in. Tonight's story takes us to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, where one decision made 10 years ago refused to stay buried. As always, viewer discretion is advised. There are moments in life that never really end. You don't relive them every day. You just learn how to carry them. Then something happens that tears them wide open again. For me, that happened on a rainy Thursday night in Biloxi, when someone I had buried in my memories showed up standing on my front porch. He hadn't aged. He hadn't changed. And he smiled at me like he had been waiting 10 years for me to answer the door. Even now, I'm not completely sure I understand everything that happened afterward. Some nights, I convince myself there has to be a logical explanation. Other nights, I wake up because I swear I hear scratching outside my bedroom window. My name is Joe Hebert, and for most people around here, I'm just another HVAC technician working the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I spend my days fixing broken air conditioners, talking football with customers, and trying to ignore the humid summers that seem to last forever. If you met me before all this happened, you'd probably describe my life as ordinary. I liked fishing on weekends. My mother expected a phone call every Sunday afternoon. My neighbors knew exactly when I left for work each morning because my old pickup truck made the same rattling noise every time I started it. Nothing about my life suggested I would ever become part of a story like this. Except there was one week every June that I hated. The anniversary, the week my best friend disappeared. His name was James Bergstrom. If you've ever had one of those friends you somehow ended up doing everything with, you'll understand what I mean. James and I weren't brothers, but we might as well have been. We explored abandoned places across Mississippi together long before ghost hunting videos became popular online. Old schools, forgotten churches, closed hospitals, factories covered in kudzu. Most of the time we found nothing more than broken glass, graffiti, and stories that grew a little bigger every time someone repeated them. James loved every second of it. He always believed the next place would be different. The next place would finally prove that legends came from somewhere. Looking back now, I wish he had been wrong. Life has a strange way of pulling people apart, even when you think they'll always be around. But before that happened, before guilt became part of my daily routine, there was one last trip we planned together. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, just another road trip with cheap gas station coffee, camera batteries rolling around the truck floor, and James talking non-stop about getting enough footage for his little YouTube channel. The destination was an abandoned amusement park locals called Magnolia Springs Fun Park, outside Jackson, Mississippi. Everyone had heard stories about it. Most people laughed them off. Some refused to drive anywhere near it after sunset. I thought we were going there to film another forgotten piece of Mississippi history. I had no idea we were driving toward the last normal day either of us would ever have. The trip started before sunrise, with rain clouds gathering over the highway and James grinning from the passenger seat, convinced this would be the video that finally made his channel take off. If I had known what was waiting for us beyond those rusted gates, I would have turned the truck around before we ever reached the park, because that was the day James Bergstrom disappeared, and somehow, 10 years later, he came back. That morning in the summer of 2014 looked completely ordinary. We stopped for coffee outside Hattiesburg, argued over which back roads would get us there faster, and laughed about the ridiculous stories people told about Magnolia Springs. Neither of us realized we were already being watched long before we ever saw the abandoned Ferris wheel rising above the trees. 10 years later, I couldn't stop replaying that drive in my head. After James appeared on my porch, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile, empty, unnatural, frozen like it belonged on a mask instead of a face. By sunrise, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. Maybe grief had finally broken something inside me. I drove straight to the Harrison County Sheriff's Office with a copy of the Ring camera footage. The deputy at the front desk barely looked interested until I insisted he watch the recording. At first he shrugged. "Probably somebody messing with you," he muttered. Then the video reached the moment where James stood under my porch light. The deputy leaned closer. His expression changed. He paused the footage and zoomed in on the figures standing behind James in the trees. "There," he whispered. My stomach tightened. The children were clearer now. Their uniforms were faded blue with tiny brass name tags. Their faces remained blurred by the rain, but their posture was perfectly still, as if they were waiting for permission to move. The deputy swallowed hard. "I've seen those uniforms before." "Where?" "Magnolia Springs Fun Park." I stared at him. "That park closed decades ago." He nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. "Exactly." A cold silence settled over the room. No uniforms from that place should even exist anymore. That single sentence shattered every excuse I'd been making for myself. Instead of going home, I spent the rest of the day digging for answers. The Harrison County Archives had yellowed newspaper clippings stacked in dusty binders. One article blamed the park's closure on a tragic drowning. Another mentioned several employees who disappeared without explanation. A third claimed 5 children had vanished over the course of 3 summers. None of the stories matched. Worse, entire newspaper pages had been ripped out, leaving only jagged edges where articles should have been. At the Mississippi Department of Public Safety Records Office, the case files were equally inconsistent. Missing reports appeared with handwritten corrections. Dates had been crossed out. Witness statements simply ended mid-sentence, as though someone had decided the truth was too dangerous to preserve. The local historical society wasn't much better. An elderly volunteer glanced at the name Magnolia Springs and quietly closed the folder in front of me. "You don't want to go digging there," she said. Before I could ask why, my phone rang. Linda Bergstrom, James's mother. I hadn't spoken to her since his funeral service, the one held without a body. When I answered, I immediately heard she had been crying. "He came here first," she whispered. My grip tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "He stood outside my bedroom window last night. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears." "What did he say?" For several seconds, she couldn't answer. Finally, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "He asked me where we buried the others." Every hair on my arms stood up. "The others?" Silence. Then she spoke again. "Don't go back to Magnolia Springs, Joe." The fear in her voice sounded real. Not grief, not confusion, fear. That night, strange things began happening. The old flashlight James had returned with suddenly clicked on by itself while sitting on my kitchen table. A children's carousel tune drifted from the radio in my garage, even though it wasn't plugged into anything. Then my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed one name. "James Bergstrom," I answered. Nothing. Only children laughing. The line disconnected. Around 3:15 a.m., my Ring camera sent another motion alert. I watched live as several small figures stood perfectly still at the edge of my yard. When deputies arrived 5 minutes later, the yard was empty. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. Sometimes our deepest fears aren't born from monsters. They're born from guilt, from the moments we wish we could undo. If this story is pulling you in, kindly like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and which part of the story hit you the hardest. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Now let's get back to the story. By sunset, I was driving back toward Magnolia Springs. The rusted entrance gate stood exactly where I'd left it 10 years earlier. Everything looked abandoned, until the Ferris wheel groaned to life. One by one, lights flickered inside the old ticket booths. A child's laughter echoed from the funhouse. Tiny shadows darted between the rides and vanished. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped toward Rusk Manor. Inside the silent house, an antique telephone began to ring. There was no electricity. I lifted the receiver. James whispered only 4 words. "Joe, you never escaped." Behind me, a closet door slowly creaked open. Pinned to the inside wall was a faded missing person poster. Joe Hebert, missing since June 14th, 2014. My name, my photograph, my face. The faded poster hanging inside that closet read, "Missing, Joe Hebert last seen, June 14th, 2014. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. I reached out and touched the brittle paper, expecting it to crumble beneath my fingers. Instead, it felt damp, as though it had been hanging there only hours instead of 10 years. "No!" The word escaped my mouth before I realized I'd spoken. This wasn't possible. I'd spent the last decade working, paying bills, visiting my mother every Sunday, and living what I believed was an ordinary life. So why did someone report me missing the same night James disappeared? The room seemed to tilt. Memories I'd trusted for years suddenly began slipping apart. Until then, I'd always remembered hearing a child crying behind the chained clown door. Now, something else pushed into my mind. Laughter. Not one child, several, soft at first, then louder, echoing through the funhouse before James vanished. Another memory surfaced. I saw myself running. My flashlight slipped from my hand. It clattered across the concrete floor. For years, I'd believed James was somewhere ahead of me, waiting, calling for help. But that wasn't what happened. I heard someone pick up the flashlight, behind me, not in front. The realization struck like ice water. I hadn't been running toward James. I'd been running away from him. A floorboard groaned upstairs. The sound snapped me back into the present. I forced myself deeper into Rusk Manor, following a narrow staircase that disappeared beneath the house. The air grew colder with every step. The walls were lined with cracked wallpaper decorated with faded nursery animals, their smiling faces stained brown with age. Below the manor, I found a series of underground rooms. Nurseries, rows of rusted cribs, tiny rocking chairs. Children's shoes lined neatly against one wall. In the center sat a desk covered in moldy journals. Every page carried the same signature, Calvin Rusk. His writings painted a horrifying picture. The newspaper stories had barely scratched the surface. Families believed their children had simply disappeared. They hadn't. Rusk had built these hidden nursery rooms beneath the manor decades before the park closed. He believed something ancient slept beneath Magnolia Springs, something that promised prosperity as long as it was fed. Children. When families began asking questions, influential people in the county buried the truth. Sheriff's reports were rewritten. Evidence vanished. Missing person files disappeared into storage. The park wasn't cursed because children vanished. Children vanished because the park was already cursed. Rusk wasn't controlling the evil. He was serving it. A sudden click echoed behind me. I turned. Linda Bergstrom stood in the doorway, clutching an old revolver with trembling hands. Her eyes looked exhausted. "I should have told you years ago," she whispered. She lowered the gun. "My real son died here." I stared at her. "What?" She nodded slowly, tears running down her face. "Calvin Rusk brought me another little boy. He looked like James. He sounded like James. I wanted him to be James so badly. I stopped asking questions." Her voice broke. "He wasn't human." The words settled over the room like ash. "He never stayed the same," she continued. "Every time he disappeared, he'd come home different. Colder, quieter." She swallowed hard, and hungrier. Before I could respond, the house shuddered. A deep groan echoed through the walls. The wallpaper began to ripple like skin. The hallway stretched impossibly long. Doors slammed open one after another. Every locked room unlocked itself. Then came the whispers, soft voices, children, all saying the same thing. "Joe, Joe, Joe." Tiny hands pushed through the wallpaper, their pale fingers clawing at the air before disappearing again. The entire manor was breathing. It wasn't haunted. It was alive. And it fed on one thing: regret. Everyone trapped inside was forced to relive the person they had failed the most. My memories returned all at once. James never cried for help. He never begged me to save him. He smiled. He chased me through the funhouse. He kept trying to force me toward the chained clown door. I escaped. He didn't. Or maybe he had never been trapped at all. The lights inside the nursery died. Silence swallowed the room. Then footsteps echoed behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned. James stood at the end of the hallway. His pale face looked exactly as it had the night he appeared on my porch, but now his smile stretched impossibly wide, splitting far beyond the corners of his mouth. He lifted my old flashlight. Its beam landed directly on me. Then, almost gently, he said, "You've been carrying part of me for 10 years." I instinctively looked toward a cracked mirror hanging on the nursery wall. My blood froze. James wasn't the one smiling anymore. I was. My smile disappeared the instant I stumbled away from the mirror. James never moved. He simply watched me, still wearing the same red flannel jacket, still holding my old flashlight, still smiling like the man I remembered had been peeled away, leaving only whatever had been hiding underneath. Then the entire manor lurched. A deafening groan rolled through the walls. Outside, thunder cracked over Magnolia Springs. The abandoned park awakened. The carousel began spinning, its faded horses rising and falling as cheerful carnival music echoed across the empty midway. The Ferris wheel slowly turned against the stormy sky. One by one, thousands of light bulbs flickered to life, bathing the rusted rides in an eerie golden glow. There was no electricity. There hadn't been for decades. Rain poured harder, hammering broken rooftops as if the park itself had begun breathing again. The walls around me pulsed. Tiny hands pushed through the wallpaper. Children whispered my name from every direction. "Joe! Joe! Joe!" James finally took a step forward. "You left me." His voice sounded almost human. "I thought I did," I answered, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "For 10 years, I believed I abandoned you." Another step. "You ran. I ran because you chased me." For the first time, his smile twitched. The memory hit me with perfect clarity. I wasn't fleeing from the chained clown door. I was fleeing from James. He had tried to drive me toward it while those children laughed from the darkness. Every ounce of guilt I'd carried for a decade had been built on a lie. "You wanted me in that room," I whispered. "You wanted to trade places." The nursery trembled violently. James's expression hardened. Behind him, Linda cried out as cracks spread across the ceiling. Then I understood. James wasn't the source. Neither was Linda. Neither were the missing children. The park was. Magnolia Springs had been feeding for generations, using grief, guilt, and loss to lure people back. It left pieces of itself inside everyone who survived, patiently waiting until they returned. None of us had ever truly escaped. We had carried the park home with us. At the center of the nursery sat the rusted music box I'd seen earlier. Its cracked porcelain ballerina slowly turned, though no one had touched it. Each note it played made the walls pulse faster. The house wasn't alive because of James. It was alive because of that song. I grabbed the music box. James screamed. Not in anger, in fear. "Don't!" he shouted, lunging toward me. I slammed the music box against the stone floor. Once, twice. On the third strike, it shattered. The melody stopped. The scream that followed didn't come from James. It came from the house. The walls split apart. The ceiling collapsed. Outside, flames erupted across Magnolia Springs, as though the earth itself had ignited. The Ferris wheel folded into itself. The carousel burst into fire. The smiling children dissolved into drifting gray ash that vanished in the rain. James looked directly at me. For one brief moment, his real face returned. He looked tired, almost relieved. Then the smile returned. His body crumbled into ash, carried away by the wind. Linda disappeared into the smoke without a sound. I threw myself through a collapsing doorway and ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I stumbled onto Highway 49 just before sunrise. The burning park disappeared behind sheets of rain. When deputies found me hours later, There was nothing left except scorched earth and twisted steel. Investigators searched for weeks. They found no underground nursery, no hidden tunnels, no evidence that Rusk Manor had ever stood where I claimed. The official report blamed an accidental wildfire that destroyed abandoned structures. Life eventually settled into something that resembled normal again, or at least I tried to believe it had. 3 nights later, my Ring camera sent another motion alert at exactly 3:15 a.m. I opened the live feed. James stood at the edge of my porch. His red flannel was soaked with rain. Linda stood silently beside him. Then another figure stepped out of the darkness behind them. The camera slowly sharpened its focus. It was me, standing beside them, smiling exactly the way James had smiled the night he returned. Some stories don't end when the fire goes out. Some follow you home, settling quietly into the corners of your life, until you begin to wonder whether you ever truly escaped in the first place. If you loved this story, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and which part of the story hit you the hardest. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them. And before you leave, answer me this. If the thing smiling at my front door wasn't James Bergstrom, then who has been living in my house since I escaped Magnolia Springs?